This is just a quick addendum to the previous video I did where I compared the resumes of Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder in order to prove that what Wilder was saying regarding AJ being coddled and steered away from the tough fights actually applies more to Wilder himself than to AJ, which is the ironic thing about it. In any event, there was somebody in the comments who took exception to that video, and they said it was unfair of me to compare Joshua and Wilder's resumes in this way because Deontay Wilder had very few amateur fights. Therefore, if a guy has only had few amateur fights, you got to move him slowly in the pros. The inference he was making is that AJ somehow has got loads of amateur experience and way more fights than Deontay Wilder and had been fighting in the amateurs at a much younger age. But nothing could be further from the truth. The guy's got it completely wrong. Anthony Joshua was not a guy like, for example, Alexander Usyk, who had hundreds of amateur fights. Usyk, incidentally, had 350 amateur fights. He was also in the WSB, which is like a semi-pro league, and he had a number more fights there. That's more experience for him. So over 350 fights before he turns pro. AJ wasn't like that. AJ had 43 fights in the amateurs. That's it. That's a pretty small number of fights compared to many of the top pros. Lennox Lewis had nearly 100 fights. Klitschko had around 100 fights. Vladimir Klitschko I'm talking about. And on it goes down the line. Most of these top heavyweight champions over the years got a vast amount of amateur experience. There are some exceptions, but with the majority of them, they got loads and loads of amateur fights. With AJ, only 43 fights. Now, with Deontay Wilder, the guy who was complaining in the comments said Wilder medaled at the Olympics after only being in boxing for 2 years, amateur boxing. That's actually not true. Deontay Wilder started boxing in 2005, and he was in the Olympics in 2008. That's 3 years, not 2. So just to correct you there. Furthermore, Deontay Wilder had 35 fights. Anthony Joshua had 43. There's barely anything in it as amateur careers go. And here's the kicker. The reason that Anthony Joshua had a few more fights in the amateurs than Deontay Wilder isn't because he went into these tournaments with loads more experience. No, he went into the world championships like Wilder was in the world championships. He went into the world championships with a very similar amount of experience to what Wilder had when he went into the world championships in 2007. The difference is that AJ progressed further in these tournaments than Wilder did. That's why he has a few more fights. Not loads more fights, just a few more fights. Because he progressed further in those tournaments. So here Wilder in the World Championships lost in the first fight in that tournament, so therefore he's out of the tournament. No more fights for him. No more fights added to his record because he's lost in the first round. He's out of the tournament. Whereas AJ, when he fought in the World Championships in 2011, he made it all the way to the final. So because he progressed further in the tournament, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more fights in the tournament than Wilder did. All right, so that accounts for 5 of the 8 more fights that AJ had as an amateur than Wilder. And then, of course, in the Olympics, I know AJ got that gift decision in the first fight against Savon, but whatever the case may be, 3 more fights, right, after the Erislandy Savon fight and 1 more fight than Wilder overall, I believe. Wilder had, I think, 3 fights in the Olympics. Yeah, 3 fights, whereas AJ had 4 fights in the Olympics. So that's 6. That accounts for 6 fights, where AJ had 6 more fights in these major tournaments because he managed to progress further. And the only difference between their amateur records is 8 fights, and 6 of them are accounted for by the fact AJ progressed further in the tournaments. So this idea that AJ's got way more experience than Wilder going into the pros is absolute nonsense. They had an almost identical amount of amateur experience. So you need to try again, and there's nothing you can actually say to back up what Wilder has been claiming, that somehow AJ was coddled and Deontay Wilder, I guess, has been fighting tough fights all along? No. Wilder was coddled more than any other heavyweight champion in living memory other than maybe Nikolai Valoev. You can't say that the tiny difference between their amateur experience, just a handful of fights, can justify Deontay Wilder having such a coddled route, not only to the title, but even as champion. Now, I'm going to do a video tomorrow about how Anthony Joshua was rushed, because I'm not actually saying that Anthony Joshua was brought along in the right way. I've always said the opposite. I've always said that Anthony Joshua needed to be moved a bit slower, not as slow as Wilder. I mean, this is really laughable. And let me tell you the real reason that Wilder was moved this slowly. Wilder, even though he had a similar amount of amateur experience to AJ, doesn't have the natural coordination and therefore can't master basic boxing technique as quickly as AJ was able to master it. That's why he didn't do as well in the amateurs, and that's why he was moved much slower in the pros. And well, one of the main reasons, not the only reason, I'll come on to that in the video tomorrow. But Wilder, with this poor balance and relatively poor coordination, he needs longer to learn the basic skills. That's why they moved him so slowly. That's why they kept him away from so many tough fights along his journey. He doesn't fight Luis Ortiz until his 40th fight. Meanwhile, AJ's fighting Klitschko in his 19th fight. So that's the real reason. And whatever the reason is, the fact of the matter is that Deontay Wilder was coddled, was protected in the very way that he accuses AJ of being protected. That's the main point of the previous video. Okay, so with AJ, he was fast-tracked. And he was fast-tracked in a way, he was fast-tracked in a manner that you would expect from a fighter like Usyk, who's had, hundreds of amateur fights. Usyk fought for a world title in his 10th fight, so he was still moved faster than AJ. But AJ, for my money, was moved too fast for a guy with such little amateur experience, for a guy who still was kind of novice-y when you saw him in he's still a bit novice-y now in the way that he moves and everything. So for me, he was fast-tracked. He should have had, I want to say, at least 5 or 6 more fights before stepping up and fighting for a world title. That's what, personally, I would have done. 5 or 6 more fights for him. And this is why I've always said that after the first Andy Ruiz fight, when he lost, that he shouldn't take the immediate rematch, that he should drop back down and start having some more learning fights, not against bums, but against people that are, a level or two below him, so he can actually learn and work on things and get his technique up to where it needs to be. But he keeps on getting thrown in the deep end, and it's like a life and death struggle where he can't really work on anything. He's just struggling to try and survive and get through the fight. You see? That's not how you bring a fighter along. And I don't know whether it's naivety on the behalf of AJ and Hearn, whether it's impatience or whether it's greed. It could be a combination of those things in terms of why AJ was moved as fast as he was. But for my money, he needed to be moved a bit slower. I think they got it right with Tyson Fury. With Tyson Fury, they moved him at the right kind of pace. They got him the right fights at the right time. They did a real good job with building Fury up. Because you look at Fury in those McDermott fights, he didn't look like a world beater, did he? But it gave him the experience that he required at the time to learn and get better and progress and so on. And so by the time he fights Klitschko, I think that was like his 24th or 25th fight. So that he was moved at the right pace. AJ was moved too fast. I mean, Deontay Wilder was coddled and protected because of the fact that he has this poor coordination and what have you. Anyway, again, nothing to do with AJ having loads more amateur fights, because as I've just shown you, Wilder and AJ have an almost identical amount of amateur experience. So all that's rubbish. Catch you guys in the next video. I'm out.